Just in case.
natural
Just
with my glasses.
Natural is fine.
Yeah.
Today is June 24th, 1985. This is Joe Todd, and this is an interview with Marion Opala in Oklahoma City. Sir, what title do you go by? Do you go by?
I'm a Justice of the Supreme Court. That's my official title.
Sir, where were you born?
I was born in Poland, Lodz, Poland, L-O-D-Z.
And when's your birthday?
January the 20th, 1921.
1921. Who was your father?
My father's name was Anthony.
And your mother?
My mother's maiden name was C-H-R-O-B-O-T. And her first name was Antonina, A-N-T-O-N-I-N-A.
And they were both from Poland, correct?
Right.
Okay.
They are both deceased now.
What type of work did your father do?
My father was a banker.
How large of the town was Lodz?
About 750,000 back at the time World War II broke out.
It was a good-sized city then.
Yes, indeed. It was the textile center of Poland.
What part of Poland is that located in?
It is in central Poland. At the time of my birth, it was western Poland. The Polish borders moved, as you know, considerably to the west with the end of World War II, so now it would be central Poland.
In the, I guess, the middle 20s, late 20s, even to the early 30s, I'd like just a general description of life in Poland in those years.
Yes.
Could you give us just a general description of what life was like?
Well, at the time that I was growing up, Poland was still a post-feudal society. Most of the population was rural. 67% of the Polish population lived literally off the land. They were engaged directly or indirectly in agricultural pursuits. That is no longer true today. I'm reliably informed that Poland today is an industrial society. The large estates were still largely intact, and there was no legislation with respect to land reform and opportunity for the small holders and small tenants to acquire the land belonging to the aristocratic families, the large estates.
And who were the major landowners? Were they?
The major landowners were invariably the old Polish nobility. Poland didn't have many titled aristocratic families, very few, less than a handful. But it had a rather large land-owning nobility that was untitled. I came from a family of middle-sized landowners of my father's side, but from a merchant class on my mother's side. My mother was not of noble birth.
Now, was there any prejudice because of that marriage?
No, not in the days when I was growing up.
Okay.
By that time, the distinctions between city dwellers and the old nobility were disappearing fastly in the large cities. But when I visited my grandfather on his estate, those distinctions were very much alive. I teach feudal land law at the University of Oklahoma Law School. And I always tell my students that to me, feudal law is part of my, so to speak, early childhood, because although that law was no longer in operation, its residue was still very vivid. I remember meeting people who had been serfs. Serfdom in the part of Poland where I grew up was not abolished until 1863. So by social standards of the United States, Poland was very backward. It was just slowly evolving from the cocoon of the Middle Ages.
Now, the government of Poland, was it headed by a monarch?
No, Poland between 1918 and 1939, when World War II broke out, was a republic. And while it was a democracy in the European sense, in that its legislature, its lower house was elected very much like the House of Commons, and the upper house was appointed by the president, much like the House of Lords. It was not the kind of democracy you and I are used to in the United States. No local official was elected. The only elected officials, well, actually, there were no officials directly elected by the people except members of the lower house. The president was elected by the legislative assembly, and as I mentioned before, the upper house was appointed by the president. So the only directly elected officials were the members of the lower house. And all local officials were appointed by the government.
Would you consider your family at that time middle class? Upper middle class?
I think we were probably right on the verge of, we were lower upper classes. Little more than middle class, and not really upper class.
Okay. The first rumblings of Hitler, when did you first become aware of, I guess, the Nazi Party in Germany, the rise of Hitler, the rumblings of World War II?
Probably not earlier than until about 1933, when I was 12 years old and learned of Hitler's rise to power.
What were your first thoughts and first impressions of Hitler?
I always think of myself as being extremely fortunate by the accident of my birth, because Polish people were unalterably opposed to any Russian or German influence. I learned to nurture a disaffection for the extreme left coming from the East, meaning the Soviet Union, and for the extreme rightist ideas coming from the West, meaning Hitler's Germany. And I thought of both Russia's, Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany as being examples of the radical political extremes, and learned early in life from my father to avoid those political extremes. And I'm very, very grateful for that, because that early schooling and indoctrination has made a centrist out of me all of my life.
The Non-Aggression Pact
Yes.
between Russia and Germany.
August 22, 1939.
What were your feelings about this?
Well, I knew it spelled out the end of Poland. We refer to it in the European terminology as the Rapallo situation. Rapallo was a little town in Italy in which early Weimar Republic and the communist government concluded a pact of friendship. So any rapprochement of the Soviet Union with the post-World War I Germany was called Rapallo syndrome, or the Rapallo syndrome. I knew any friendship, no matter how transient, spelled out the end of post-World War I Poland. That was very clear to me, and I sensed that that World War II was very near. We knew that.
September 1st, 1939. Invasion of Poland. What were you doing when the Germans invaded?
I was not yet back in school, but back from my summer vacation. It was a European custom between the two wars for middle class and upper middle class kids to leave the cities during their school vacation. And I was between high school and university at that time. And I had just concluded my summer vacation because it was my custom to return a little earlier and spend a few weeks with my father. And I believe my mother and my father, but not my sister, were back from their vacation. And when the war broke out, I recollect that my sister had returned from her vacation the day before the war broke out, and I recall the chaos that reigned on the Polish railroads shortly before the outbreak of the war. Everyone had expected that the hostilities to break out between Hitler's Germany and Poland, and there was a rush to return from summer vacation. I was too young. There had been mobilization. There had been a mobilization, I don't recall how many days or weeks before September 1, but I do recall that the reserves had been called to active duty.
Now, how far from Lodz is, how far from Warsaw?
140 kilometers. Lodz is 140 kilometers southwest of Warsaw.
Did the Germans come to your town?
Yes, they arrived probably 8 or 9 days after September 1. I don't recall. Probably on the 8th of September.
Were you there?
Yes.
What did you do?
Well, there was an exodus from my hometown. Most people fearing the Germans' arrival, some of them escaped to Warsaw, and those were trapped in the siege of Warsaw by the Germans, and some of them escaped to the eastern territories of Poland and later fell into the hands of the advancing Soviet troops. As it turned out, I think my parents and I were wise in not leaving. Had we left, we would have either wound up in the besieged Warsaw, that was, so to speak, under fire, under German fire for about 3 weeks, or at least 2 weeks longer than my hometown, or I would have fallen into the hands of the communists who, as it turned out, were shipping Polish people into Siberia. At least many wound up in the Siberian villages from which they were later rescued by the Sikorsky-Stalin Pact that was entered into under the auspices of the British government, and which allowed the Poles to then leave the Soviet Union. Most of them were being sheltered. Those who were not subject to draft remained in Persia, Iran, or in Egypt until the end of the war, and those of draft age wound up with the second Polish Corps of General Anders that fought in Africa and later in Italy.
Was there much resistance in your hometown to the Germans? Was there resistance?
Well, my hometown Lodz was incorporated into Germany very shortly after the arrival of the Germans, I would say within 2 months, by a decree of the German government. The territory of Poland, which included my hometown, became a part of the German state. And we knew at that point that we had either to leave or be resettled into the remainder of Poland, which was set apart for ethnic Poles. Many of the Polish citizens who were of German origin were permitted, of course, were given German citizenship and permitted to remain in my hometown. But those who were considered to be ethnic Poles either had to leave of their own free will or stand forced to resettle, and we didn't want to wait until we were forcibly resettled, so we moved to Warsaw of our own free will. So by 1940, I would say in the forepart of 1940, my family had moved to Warsaw.
Was it difficult to move in that period?
Well, yes, indeed, because the borderline between the newly incorporated Polish territories that became part of Germany and the so-called territories of the general government, which was the euphemism for Poland that the Germans used, were tightly guarded. And if you were making the journey on your own without a passport, as we did, we had to be smuggled across the borderline, so to speak, across the boundary.
So you were smuggled across?
Right.
How were you smuggled?
Well, strangely enough, all we had to do is pass that boundary line, that line of demarcation, and go to the next railroad station on the Polish side. And once we got to that, it was a simple way for us to just catch the train to Warsaw.
So there were no trouble with German guards or anything?
No. The problem was taking our belongings with us, and we could take few, if any, belongings. We were able to bring very few belongings with us.
And where did you settle in Warsaw?
We settled with friends. We had quite a few friends, and we managed to rent an apartment from friends.
And was there a resistance movement in Warsaw?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Did you join the resistance?
I joined the resistance. Actually, I could play a hero. I didn't join it. I received a draft card. I was drafted into the resistance movement. And that was the way with most people of my age. We were not trusted in the sense that you couldn't join. You had to be drafted or called to join.
And when were you drafted into the movement?
It was in the forepart of 1941. 41. I was old enough by then, I suppose.
What were your duties in the resistance?
I did mostly translations and occasionally I carried messages. And I don't know what these messages contained. And neither was I allowed to know from whom and to whom they were being carried. In other words, the security was so strict that not the same person would give me orders. Somebody would appear, I had to report where I would be at certain times. Somebody would appear and tell me what to carry, what to do, and that person would not identify himself or herself to me, but would simply say, do this. I would identify that person by password, and they would, of course, require me to do the same before the approach was made. But beyond that, I never knew anything about the people I dealt with, nor, as far as I know, they about me.
Where would you meet?
We would meet, first of all, there was strict curfew in Warsaw. So we had to meet, I forget, the curfew I think would begin at something like 6 or 7 in the evening, and that included summertime, and would be lifted by 7 or 6:30, I forget, in the morning. We would always meet during the time that the public were allowed in the streets. That was an added precaution, so we would never stand out.
How did you carry the messages?
Usually I would carry it in a European-type suitcase. At times, and I suppose that depended on the nature of the message, I would be required to carry it on my person, under my shirt, or strapped to my body, occasionally, and that would be in the instructions.
Any close calls of being caught?
Several times, but not by being spotted. That, luckily, I escaped by being spotted or denounced by some person who knew or something. The 3 or 4 close calls I had were accidental, like a German roundup of people. That happened, a dragnet, occasional street dragnet. I would be in that or find myself. I always carried an identification card that protected me to some extent. The card that would identify me as an employee of either a German agency or some kind of an office that was important to the Germans. And I recall distinctly my identification card was both in Polish and the German. And of course it was designed to facilitate my passing, my being let free in case of a dragnet. And street roundups were quite common. People had to learn to live with it. The objective of these roundups was to capture resistance people who were not able to identify themselves, and that made them suspicious per se. Jews and resistance members who were dropped by parachute by the English or by the Soviets.
Did this ID card rescue you from the dragnets? Was it successful?
Yes, I would say that not a single time was I detained after showing that card. Not a single time was I. I was let go each one of those 2 or 3 times that I simply walked into round up.
If a resistance member was captured, what happened? What happened to him?
Well, the thing we feared the most was interrogation, because no matter how little we knew, we felt that the Gestapo tortures were cruel enough to make nearly everyone, even the strongest people, too weak to retain the secrets. And that's what we feared very much. Strangely enough, we were not equipped. I don't know of anybody who had cyanide capsules. So we feared very much being subjected to torture and revealing secrets. And I take it that's the reason why we knew so little as individuals, or were not allowed to know much.
The Warsaw Uprising.
Mm-hmm.
Were you involved in that?
Yes, I was involved in that. That's probably one of the most tragic things in my life. As it turned out, I am fortunate to have been in it, but it was a very tragic event. As you know, the Polish forces were ordered to engage the Germans, ordered by the Polish government in London to engage the Germans in an open battle. Polish underground was, and the bottom line of that was that Warsaw was totally destroyed. When I was captured, and I don't remember exactly the day, but it was either the 26th or the 27th of August. The insurrection began, the uprising began August 1 of 44. So I was captured about almost 4 weeks, not quite 4 weeks after that. There was not a single building standing in Warsaw, as far as I could see it, except one church. And I could tell that the church was nothing but a shell, burned out shell. And I was marched across the city after being captured to a collection point at which they, as I learned later, they separated people, and those who were not given the status of combatants in accordance with the Geneva Convention landed in concentration camps. Those who were given a status of full-fledged prisoner landed in POW enclosures, and someone like myself was treated in between. I really was a POW, but I wound up in a kind of a I would call it a punishment camp for soldiers, which was an in-between status. And ultimately, shortly before the end of the war, they transferred me to a POW status. And I don't know to this day how I managed to get out of this punitive enclosure or enclave, punitive enclave of POW.
Did you take an active part in the combat in the uprising?
Yes.
What
did I do?
Yes,
I just had a rifle and was shooting and continued to translate messages from London and continued to carry messages with the one exception that I now was armed openly, whereas as a resistance member I was not allowed to carry arms at all, except when my specific mission required it, and my the hand firearms that would be furnished to me would be taken away from me after the mission. It's another aspect of the resistance activities that is not well known to the people. We were very careful. They didn't want us to be caught wearing firearms because that in itself would be a death sentence. The Poles were not authorized to possess firearms. So if they caught any one of us in possession of firearms, that in itself would be a giveaway, a sure giveaway.
Where were you captured? What part of Warsaw?
I was captured in the near the royal castle, which is the northern, or I would say mid-northern part of the city.
The destruction of the Warsaw ghetto. Now, what part of the city is that?
The Warsaw ghetto was in the mid-central part, or maybe mid-central part of the city. But that was considerably west of the royal castle. Where I was captured, the part of the city is called in Polish the Old City, the medieval city, where the streets are very narrow, and the medieval buildings, now restored, were still intact. And that's the Old City, or the Walled City is a better translation, Walled City.
Now,
the ghetto was to the west and southwest of that part.
I understand the majority of the people in the ghetto were Jews.
All of the people in the ghetto were either Jews or persons considered by the Germans to be Jews. And I don't know what formula the German used. They were very arbitrary in the sense that half-Jews at times were treated as Jews, and other times they were not treated as Jewish people. And below the half-Jews, I don't know how, it was very arbitrary, and I don't know, for instance, what the status would be of an octoroon or a 1/8 Jew or 1/4 Jew. What I do remember is that persons with half or less than half of Jewish blood would conceal it, would acquire a different identity, and unless they looked very Jewish, they were fairly safe.
The camp that you were placed, the punitive camp.
Yes.
Where was that located?
That was in Saxony. Saxony is in the in southeastern part of pre-World War II, of Germany that existed before the end of World War II. It is now East Germany. Zwickau was the city, Zwickau. And because I was an enlisted man, I was required to work. Officers, as you know, in these POW and even in punitive camps, were not required to work.
Were you transported by train to this camp?
Yes, in
And-
cattle cars.
And what type of work did you have to perform?
I worked on tank engines. At an assembly line on probably Tiger tanks, but I'm not sure. On an assembly line, just had a task, one task to perform. I was building in magnetos, building in generators.
How were you treated by the Germans?
I was treated, I would say, not cruelly, except that we all suffered from lack of adequate nourishment. but there was not daily terror in the camp that I could tell. Occasionally, terror would be applied after attempts of escape, and that would last about 2 or 3 days. Invariably, the people involved would be shot and their bodies would be exhibited. And once or twice, corporal punishment was administered. I forget what were the infractions that the prisoners allegedly committed. But other than that, our main problem was malnutrition, and they were rifling our Red Cross packages. That was a problem. It seems that the only thing they would let us have from the Soldiers International Red Cross packages would be small cans of processed cheese. I recall getting that. And that's about it. Maybe once or twice some crackers, but the rest of the Red Cross packages would be rifled.
And how long were you in this camp?
I was there until about mid-April of 1945, or maybe the first week of April, when we were evacuated because of the advancing Russians and walked south, east, and southwest. I wound up in Sudetenland, which is that part of Germany which is now in Czechoslovakia, and I was turned loose by the guards. Literally, all of us were turned literally loose one morning. They told us to run. And I recall there were a few Russian POWs in that camp. Some of them got executed in this. And I don't know how they chose the Russians that they executed. I don't know of any Polish people, Polish POWs who were executed during that chaotic release of ours. But then I was liberated by the American forces probably not more than 6 days after my release, maybe less than 6 days.
What were your living quarters in the camp?
The barracks, we were all in German type barracks. Probably, as I recall, 3-tier beds with straw mattresses. And strangely enough, we had bathing facilities available to us only once a week. Lice, I recall, were a terrible problem. But not all the time, a part of the time. We were just, let's face it, just covered with lice. And other than that, sanitary conditions were not the best, or we would not have been infested with lice. I never had any head lice. It was always body lice. I guess we were all clean our hair was cut down to the skin. So there was no problem with head lice, nor pubic lice, but always body lice.
When you first saw the Americans, what was your reaction?
I was choked. Couldn't believe it.
What did you do then, after you were liberated?
We were, there were several of us in that village. I don't remember how many, but I estimate that the group of prisoners I was with may have been, oh, I forgot to tell you, those prisoners on the evacuation march who could not follow were all executed. So actually what remained were the strongest and the fittest survivors. And I don't know how many survived out of 150. But I would say probably not more than maybe 60 or 80.
How far was that march?
Um, all the way from Zwickau into Sudetenland, which over a period of 10 or 14 days, I would say 150 miles at least, maybe 200 miles.
What
And
food did you eat on the march?
the same kind of food, very little bread, and no warm soups, nothing warm, just they gave us a little bit of the German bread. So I don't know how we managed to keep up, because they marched us at a fairly fast pace. We were, those of us who survived were all young people. As I recall, people over 40 seldom, if ever, could keep up with the pace, and they were the ones who would be executed, taken to the side of the road and executed. We could hear the shots.
When did you decide to come to this country?
I really did not expect to. I was very lucky. I was in the process of seeking a visa from the English government to Sydney, Australia, when a friend of mine, a person who befriended me from Oklahoma, wrote me a letter and offered a visa for me, or offered to seek a visa. And that's how I came.
Who was this?
The man's name is Gene Warr, W-A-R-R. He's still alive.
How did you come in contact with Mr. Warr?
He was a member of a military police detachment that came upon us within maybe 10 days after we were liberated. And he and I struck up a friendship that has lasted since 1945, since the end of the war. He and I still see each other nearly every month, not more often than that. He lives in Oklahoma City, and at that time, he did not have the financial resources to sponsor me. He prevailed on his father to do it, and it was his father, who is now deceased, who made it possible for me to come to the States. I came in 1947 by boat. I landed in New Orleans and took a Santa Fe train from there to Oklahoma City. He met me at the Union Station, and I've lived in Oklahoma City ever since, except for 3 consecutive summers in New York while I was getting a master's degree in law.
Between 45 and 47, where did you live?
I was in England part of that time and part in West Germany, both in the American and the British occupations.
You never returned to Poland?
No, not each time. I was afraid to go back for fear that I could not get out.
When did you attend law school?
I attended law school beginning 1949, and I graduated in 53 here in Oklahoma City University Law School.
Mm-hmm. And what type of work were you doing while you were attending?
First, I worked for the person who sponsored me in a lumber yard that they owned. And then once I became a bit better adapted to Oklahoma, I took a job. I was fortunate to get a job with Cook Electric Supply, and I became an inside salesman of electrical supplies and appliances. And I stayed with Mr. Cook until after I passed the bar and got my first job as a lawyer, and that was with the county attorney's office at the end of 1953. I passed the bar and became a lawyer in July of 53, and I secured my first job as a lawyer about December of that year, and that's when I quit Cook Electric Supply, and I became an assistant county attorney.
Who was county attorney?
Granville Scanlon, who died about 2 years ago.
And what were your main duties as assistant
County attorney. At first, I began by conducting preliminary hearings in felony cases, and then I graduated to being a prosecutor of misdemeanor cases in the Common Pleas Court, which was the misdemeanor court at that time, and on to felonies. When I ended my career as an assistant county attorney in December of 56, December of 56, I was prosecuting felony cases.
And you say you received a master's in New York City.
Right. I was interested in teaching law, and I felt that I was a bit undereducated for that. So I went to New York and got a master's degree in law from the New York University School of Law. And I got that in mid-60s, and then returned. I was teaching at Oklahoma City University Law School. And then I did not go back to get a doctorate.
How does one receive a judgeship
Yes.
on the Supreme Court? How did that come about?
Well, I was fortunate in that when the legislature wrote the court reform in 67, and then the people adopted it, I was very active in it. And I was fortunate in that the Senate asked the Supreme Court to appoint me as the first statewide administrator of the new legislatively created court system. I had worked closely with the Senate, and they wanted me, Senator Alan Nichols, Senator Robert G., Senator Grantham, all now either deceased or retired from the Senate, thought that I could implement the legislative intent, and I was appointed court administrator in 1968. Then I remained in that job until 1977, when Senator Bourne appointed me to be presiding judge of the industrial court, now workers' compensation court. And then 18 months later, the same governor appointed me to the Supreme Court.
When did you receive your citizenship?
In March of 1953, before I graduated from law school. Oklahoma at that time was the only state in the Union that allowed non-citizens to become lawyers. But I didn't know about it. Luckily for me, I had become a citizen 4 months before I became a lawyer, but that's just a coincidence.
What are your main duties now as a sitting judge?
My job is to review civil judgments in civil cases, and judgments in those other cases, non-criminal cases, in which there is no review of a conviction. The only thing we cannot do is review convictions, criminal convictions. That's the job of the Court of Criminal Appeals. And so we review. I'm one of 9 members of the top civil court. And in that connection, I review those judgments with a view to deciding whether the judgment should stand, be changed, or a retrial be had back in the county whence the case came. And I'm very much challenged intellectually by the job. I consider it an honor to be on the court and to actively participate in its work. I told Senator Boren, who as governor appointed me, that I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up till he appointed me to the Supreme Court. I love the job. It's very responsible work and stressful at times. We work long hours.
Good. Are you familiar with the town of Lockfa, Poland?
No, how do you spell it?
I think it's Lachwa.
No, no. It's not a large city, or I would
No.
be familiar.
I interviewed a man named Israel Slutsky, and he was born and raised in Lockfa, and that's where they had the first uprising against the Germans in 43. Just quickly get down.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
That must be in eastern
Yeah.
Poland. I come from western Poland.
In fact, he mentioned it is in Russia now.
Yes, that would be in what we considered between the two wars to be eastern Poland, which is now part of Russia.
Do you ever reflect on your life in Poland? And
Oh yes,
What?
occasionally. I try not to think about it. Of course, I'm grateful now for the experience. I think it has made me politically sound. As I told you previously, I attribute my moderate political views, my centrist attitudes, to my childhood in Poland and my staunchly centrist political philosophy to that. And I'm also grateful that I never had to look for a cause in my life. The cause that has served me well for a lifetime was, so to speak, tendered to me on a silver platter with the outbreak of World War II. And I've never searched for a cause to choose and to fight for. I just had one. From the time I was 18 years old. That's how old I was when the war broke out. I didn't have to search for causes. I had it.
Well, sir, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
This is June 25th, 1985. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Mr. J.T. Bailey in Norman, Oklahoma. Mr. Bailey, where were you born?
In Wise County, Texas,
And when's your birthday?
September 4, 1892.
And who is your father?
Joseph R. Bailey. J.R. Bailey is the way he was assigned.
And your mother?
Pearl A. Bailey.
And her maiden name?
Flowers, F-L-O-W-E-R-S.
Were they both from Texas?
No, they were both born in Tennessee.
Could unplug it.
Yeah, you could.
Both your parents were from Tennessee?
Yes.
What part of Tennessee?
My father was born in Lynwood, Tennessee. That's, I can't name that county. It's in Middle Tennessee, and Pulaski is the county seat. I might say this, and you probably know this already, that Pulaski is the place that the Ku Klux Klan originated. My
Have you heard-
father left that country when he was about 16 or 17 years old.
Why did they leave? Why did they leave Tennessee?
On account of my father's health. He couldn't, they moved west, he came to West Tennessee and married my mother there. She was born in Kenton, or near Kenton, that's in West Tennessee. And there's some swampy land area there that he couldn't live without after coming in from the mountains. And then they married there in 1887. I believe I'm right about that. And immediately came to Texas mother had relatives in Chico, Texas.
Ever hear any stories about the formation of the KKK?
Ku Klux Klan. Well, yeah, see, I'm afraid I'm getting confused now on the, I told you that they, maybe the Ku Klux Klan that originated in Alaska. What was the one I told you before that? I told you it originated at Pulaski. What did I tell you originated?
Yeah.
Did I say
believe
Ku
so.
Klux Klan?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well that's what it was.
Okay. What type of work did your father do?
Farmer. That's all
Farmer.
he ever did. I knew all.
Did you know your grandparents?
I never saw either of my grandparents. I've never seen a one, not even a distant relative of my father's. I've known some of them by name from my mother. My father never would discuss his family affairs, except to some one old lady that took a liking to him when he was a boy back there in Middle Tennessee, and it was a familiar name, and I was trying for the last 4 or 5 years to remember her name, but I can't remember it. But she was a very prominent old lady there in Linville that apparently kind of looked after young boys, and my father was very fond of her. I never heard my father mention his father's name or a brother or a sister, but he was talking about, when he mentioned that country back there, he was talking about the name of this old lady and his relationship with her when he was a small boy.
What about your mother's side of the family?
Well, my mother's folks were all from West Tennessee, around Kenton.
Were either one of your grandfathers in the Civil War?
I'm inclined to think that probably both of them were. I'm more certain about my father's father than I was about my mother's father. I've got a picture of him, and he was born, well, his oldest, no, his youngest child was born in 1853, I believe, a year before my father was born. So he might have been too old for the Civil War. But the reason I think that my grandfather Bailey was in the Civil War is that his name was Robert Bailey, and he was a cripple. Had a leg gone, I believe, from what my mother. And all I'm telling you now is what my mother told me when I was a small child, and continued to talk some later. And I know he was a radical Southerner. And then I had an uncle, so my mother told me, or told me rather when I was small, whose name was Polk Bailey. So there's a Polk Bailey. Well, wait a minute, maybe it's not Bailey, but anyway, he was either Polk Bailey or was named after James K. Polk. Is that from the Civil War?
Yes. Well, he was
Who was
president.
a radical Southerner and fought for the continuation of slavery. And the fact that my father had a brother named Polk Bailey, and his father was Robert Bailey, which Robert E. Lee, of course, was the commander-in-chief of the Southern force, the Confederate forces. And Polk, James K. Polk, was the one that was fighting for slavery, radically. So I get that in my own history. And by reading of those names, and knowing that they came from that country which largely believed in slavery, I'm inclined to think that my grandfather lost that leg in the Civil War, but I don't know that, except that's speculation on my part there now.
Did your father homestead in Texas?
No, he didn't. He owned a little plot of land there, I think, and the people in that country was as poor, I think, as it's possible for people to be and still live, because it was the sorriest part of Texas. The sorriest county in Texas, I think, except probably Jackson County, which is practically all mountains that are joined in on the west.
What part of Texas is that?
Well, it's about approximately 50 miles, I believe, from Bowie, Texas. It's kind of north central Texas, I'd call it. Except it is quite a ways down in central Texas. It was.
How large was the farm in Texas? How many acres?
Oh, I have no idea. I don't know even whether my father owned it. I've got a picture of the house where I was born. So a fellow tells me that was 9 years old when I was born. And that's the way I got my all the cards you get to identify yourself. What is it?
Birth certificate.
Birth certificate. That's how I got my birth certificate. But this fellow was about 9 years old when I was born, and he lived nearby at the time, and made an affidavit that he knew my folks when I was born and where I was born. And then later years, when Jay and I went back downland into that country, he described and told me where the little house was that I was born in, and I got a picture of it and brought it back and showed it to him, and he said, that's the place where you were born. And I've got that picture, of course, now.
What crops did you raise on the farm in Texas?
As far as I can remember, it was mostly cotton, but I was too young to remember very much about the crops. But I know that it was cotton and corn, I think, principally. There might have been some what we called Capricorn, but that's, I don't remember much about that. And sorghum cane, because they had sorghum mills at that time. I remember when I was about 3 years old, my father was taking me to the sorghum mill, and I remember all my life how that thing operated, because it had horses, team of horses, and I've got a kind of hazy recollection. Some of the time they had 4 horses attached to that sorghum mill, and of course that's a thing that you turn around in circles, and the rollers roll the juice out of the cane, the sorghum cane, and they had a big vat where they cooked that stuff, cook it down, then they skim off the top of it that was no good. They just skim that off and throw it away or feed it to the hogs. And that, of course, I learned later that was what now is blackstrap molasses that's more expensive than the sorghum molasses. They threw it away in those days. Nobody knew anything about health measures in those days, or not, at least not in connection with sorghum cane.
How long did you live in Texas?
Well, I left Texas. I was about 3.5 years old. We came through in the covered wagon train in 1896, and I'd say it's the summertime, because we cooked outside on a campfire and slept in the wagon. Some of the people that had large families, some of them sleep in the wagon, covered wagon, and some would sleep out on the ground on pallets. But we always slept in our wagon, because just the 3 of us, I slept in the middle, of course. And we slept in the wagon. We never did sleep outside. I think I remember that. I don't think we ever did.
Remember what type of wagon it was?
It was either a Bain or a looting horse, and I forget which one. They had both kinds, both names. But I believe it was a looting horse. L-E-U-D-I-N-G-H-A-U-S, I believe. I'm not sure about the spelling on
Who
that.
made the best wagons?
Well, Bain, I think, was the more prominent one, as I remember, B-A-I-N. But that looting horse was a good wagon. But, I believe that's what we came in, or Dad bought one after we got to Warsaw County, but I think we kept our same wagon there for as long as the wagon we used.
Do you remember what you packed for the trip to Oklahoma?
What we packed?
Yes, sir, in the wagon.
Not very much. Our bedding and cooking utensils were about it. My father chartered a car. Now, they used to do that regular, you see. Chartered a railroad car to bring all the household stuff. And of course, we had quite a lot of stuff, as much as the usual family, small family had in Texas. Among other things, we had a monkey Montgomery Ward's sewing machine that was brought through. We had a dresser and about the usual things people had back in those days.
Can you tell me just some incidents about the wagon trip? What you remember of the trip?
Well, I can remember a lot of things about it. We came through in what was then called the Big Canyon. There was a wagon trail through there, and of course a wagon trail was just a trail in those days. There was no such thing as a paved road, or even an improved road. It's just such road as you wore the grass and vegetation down enough to where you could follow it. It's merely a trail. Now that there's a place down there in the mountains adjacent, that's right at the head of that big, what we call the Big Canyon. Mears, M-E-E-R-S. It's just a store there. I don't think there's anything else but a store there now, and I think it's still there. It was at least last time I was in
Is
there.
that in Texas?
No, that's in Oklahoma.
It is? Okay.
North and west of Lawton. But from between Chico, Texas, and the Big Canyon, we call it.
Is that in the Wichita Mountains?
Wichita Mountain.
Wichita.
Mhm.
Wichita.
But we came through. We
Yeah.
came through Sunset, Texas. I can vaguely remember that because we used to go to Algor a lot. That is maybe a little closer to us than Chico. We're almost midway between. I was born almost midway between Chico and Algor. And I remember we came through Algor, and we used to go there a lot when I was a small child. There was a family that lived closer to Algor than we did, the Bill Strange family, and their oldest daughter was, I believe, a couple of years older than I. In fact, I corresponded with her after I came to Oklahoma when I got big enough to read, where I could read and write. And Bill Strange had some boys that were older. No, the girl was the oldest child. The boys were a little younger, but they were older than I were.
Who was he, this Bill Strange?
He was just another farmer neighbor of ours. My father and Bill Strange were very intimate friends, see, and that's how we'd visit. They'd visit with us on Sunday and back and forth. I can remember that vaguely. And then when we came to Oklahoma, I think my mother continued to correspond with Mrs. Strange. I don't remember much about Mrs. Strange. I remember Bill Strange, this old man, and this oldest girl that was about my age. And then we came through Sunset, Texas. That's another little town that was, I remember, north of Chico. Then on into Oklahoma, and I can't have much recollection about crossing the Red River. There was no bridge.
Well, I was going to ask about fording the rivers. Did you?
Well, we forded the river, but the river probably wasn't high. You see, that Red River in that area is sandy. It had quicksand in there. And of course, I had some experience later when I was in high school, crossing in the quicksand and having trouble getting out of it with a schoolmate of mine whose father was a car dealer. That was back in 1914 or 15, of course. But there was no bridge there as I remember, because it'd come a big rain, it'd sweep out most everything, you know. The way they built bridges those days, they didn't build a bridge to stop a lot of water. But
when you were traveling, how did you know where you were going?
I just knew we were going to Oklahoma. I didn't know where. But then as we came through the Big Canyon, which is it mirrors, if you've ever been in that country, you probably know where a mirrors is. It's just, I think the store's all there is there, even if it's there. I don't know now whether it's still there, but it was up until a few years ago. Just the store, maybe a post office. I'm not sure about the post office, whether they ever had a post office or not. But anyhow, I can remember when we stopped at that store and we bought some groceries there, something to eat, to carry along with us, you see. And then we went into the Big Canyon, on the trail in the Big Canyon, which is an open highway, I think, through there now. But anyway, mountainous area, and it's practically all mountains. There was a little white house up on a hilltop, and that was old Big Tree's home. He was an Indian chief. I don't know what tribe, but, probably a Kiowa, but I don't know that. But anyway, the old folks were talking about Big Tree. Now, incidentally, those blanket Indians, we call them, were the Plains Indians, like the Cheyenne and Arapaho and Kiowa and Caddo and those people. They either lived in a teepee or in what they call a brush arbor, but the better ones of them had a white house, generally a two-room white house. Where they got the lumber to build it, I don't know. But anyway, that's the way they lived then. And, old Big Tree's house was up on this hill about, maybe 150, 200 yards from our road. And we didn't see old Big Tree. I never saw him in my life that I remember of. But folks pointed out the house. The old Big Tree, old Chief Big Tree's house. And then they related stories about what he did when they make an Indian raids. Of course, Indian raids is a thing of the past practice when we came.
What did they tell you about the Indian raids?
Well, they told me this, or they talked among themselves. They weren't telling me anything. I was just listening. But they were talking about how old Big Tree, when they make an Indian raid on a white settlement and killed off the whites. And of course, they probably killed more whites than whites killed Indians. But anyway, they said that old Big Tree would get the little baby. It was a baby, maybe, and generally was. He'd toss that little baby up there and catch it on his bowie knife. Well, my God, my little hair stood on the end. I can just see that little old house now, and I can remember so distinctly about that story about the way old Big Tree did little children. Of course, that wasn't universal among the Indians. Now, I don't know if it ever happened, as a matter of fact. They just talk, but anyhow, I do know that the Indians, chiefs sometimes would adopt the baby. They'd murder all the people, all the whites, you see, when they make an Indian on a white settlement and kill everybody but the baby. Well, then this Indian chief would take that baby and adopt it into the tribe. And of course, they grew up in the tribe and they loved it and it become a part of them. And strange coincidence there that's happened recently. You see that girl's picture up there?
Yes, sir.
You recognize her?
I recognize the picture.
You know who she is? She's the newest member of our state Supreme Court. She was born in Coney. That's that little town out there. It was an Indian settlement. You would probably know something about that when an old man by the name of John H. Seeger came out there as a government agent in 1875 and established an Indian school at Colony.
Did you know him? You know John Seeger?
I slightly remember him. Yes, I wasn't personally acquainted with him. I was personally acquainted with his oldest son, Jed Seeger, and I was in summer school with his youngest son. I can't think of that boy's name. He was a little older than I. No, he's about my age. But they
Ever
were
hear
all-
any stories about John Seeger?
Nothing except that he was there to establish that Indian school and to teach those Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians how to live like white folks. And of course, he had quite a job because when you go changing them over from their native ways, they kind of go to the bad. And they had more drunks Indians out there than the whites. They had some pretty decent Indians out there, and some of them were not. And it's still there. I don't know whether it's Indian. I guess the school operates now, but there's quite a few prominent Indians out there, Indian artists. I'll tell you a long story about this girl. She studied law in my office when she was 16 years old.
What's her name?
Yvonne Cogger, Yvonne-Kauger. That's her maiden name. She's been married 3 times. She always kept her maiden name. And incidentally, she was appointed to fill a vacancy in the Supreme Court in January 83, I believe on that. Might be 84. I get confused on some of these recent happenings. But anyway, she grew up with the Indians. She likes the Indians, and I can show you a bunch of pictures. I'll have a file in there on her. I'll be glad to show you. We'll go in there. And she has established a Indian art studio out there. And she has only what I call blanket, what we always call blanket Indians, that are, I guess, nationally known for their Indian art. Some from Tulsa that comes over there regularly, and she meets with them and sponsors them. Then, after she was appointed in January to the Supreme Court, and after the appointment, the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe adopted her into the Indian tribe, conducted the Indian adoption ceremony. And at that time, there was a girl in law school here that lived at McAllister, and who was a senior in the law school room down here on one of the streets down here. I can't remember the name of the street, I know where she lived. But anyway, Yvonne was teaching her law. Now, Yvonne, I'm getting into the story about her, that's a story within itself. But anyway, to make it short right now, she took this girl under her wing and was teaching her the trial tactics of a lawsuit, because Yvonne was a trial lawyer before she was appointed on the Supreme Court, and a good one. But she was teaching this girl the things you don't get in the law book, the trial tactics, how the tricks you want to play in trying a lawsuit. And she was teaching this girl for trial tactics. And she was going to, as soon as she got her license, which would have been this spring, she was going to, back to McAllister, start trying lawsuits. But following that, and after Yvonne was appointed, and Yvonne hadn't been appointed right now, you see, but she was the assistant to Justice Hodges for 10 years. And then when Yvonne was appointed, she selected this girl for her legal assistant. Well, the law school here just forgot all about the diploma and handed her a diploma, even though she wasn't entitled to receive it later. They figured that if she was good enough to be Yvonne's legal assistant, that she didn't need a law degree anyway, because that was, they just advanced it to her. And she's now the legal assistant to Yvonne up in the Supreme Court. But I went out there to that ceremony, and that was something. Of course, that's just a little town. There's a barber shop there, I think.
What town is that?
Colony.
Yeah.
That's in the northeast part of Washoe County.
Whenever you came to Oklahoma by wagon, where did you settle?
Where did I sit?
Yes, sir.
Oh, I sat between my parents.
No, where'd your parents settle? What part of the state?
4.5 miles southeast of Cloud City. My father bought out the relinquishment back in those now. You'd come to this, they didn't make the run now. The run was in 1809, that's this country right here. But Washita County and Blaine County, or at least part of Blaine County, Custer, Dewey, Ellis, I believe that's all that was included in the settlement at that time. Now, they didn't make a race like they did now.
Was that the Great Lottery?
That's a lottery, yes.
Yeah.
And you drew for the place, you see, and then you went and come in there and drove a stake on it, and settled on it, and started your home there. But you had to live on it 5 years to prove up on it. And to prove up on it, you had to live there 5 years to make it your home. And if you did that, why then the issue at the end of that 5 years, they'd issue the patent to it. Well, my father bought out a relinquishment from and I'm confused a little bit on this one. His name was Ada Hester, A-D-A, man, but he spelled A-D-A Hester, and he had a son named Glenn Hester, who was a year or two older than me. I remember that. But one of the other neighbors that came there about the same time we did was one of the youngest girls among that family. Well, she wasn't born yet, but far. But she says that her father bought Ada Hester out, and there's some indication of that. The details that I can relate. But if that family, that's the MacDonald family, if Mr. MacDonald bought Ada Hester out, he then sold to my father. That may have happened. I don't know. Not clear on.
What type of house did you live in when you first came?
We lived in a tent for about a year when we lived on the MacDonald place that joined us on the south. Now the MacDonalds, they came a little earlier than we did, but they came from Wise County down near Alvord. That's a different settlement entirely. We didn't know them down there. I don't think they did. My parents may have known each other. But
Tell me about living in a tent. What was life like in a tent?
well, it's just it wasn't like an Indian teepee. It was a tent that a large family could get in. Generally, it's a different size tent, so we didn't have a big tent. We had the tent big enough for the three of us. We could cook in there, you see, and sleep in there. And
How large was the tent?
oh, I couldn't say. It just probably it wouldn't be as large as this room. I would say probably. Of course, it wouldn't be shaped like this room. It'd be more like lengthwise, but as I remember it, it would probably be approximately half in the area of this room.
What, about 6 by 8 feet, 8 by 10 feet?
8 by 10 feet, I think,
Yeah.
might be near.
Did the tent keep out the rain and the weather?
Well, somewhat, yes.
What about when it rained? What happened?
I don't remember I don't remember that we had any rain much at that time because we lived on the MacDonald place while my father was trying to fix a place to live on the place that we had piled on, had taken the lease on.
What furnishings did you have in the tent?
I don't remember. We had a stove, I think. Yeah, I think we had a cook stove. And bedsteads, I don't remember about that. Whether we moved that stuff from. I just don't remember when we did that because what we had to do, if I haven't figured out right, the nearest railroad was the Rock Island, north and south, through El Reno, Chickasee, Minco, and there was a little old town Sogden in there somewhere, but I don't know just where it was, but it's on that railroad line. Well, that's 60 miles from where we lived. Well, the men folks would make freighting trips, they called it. 4 or 5 neighbors all go together and take their wagons and teams to go get provisions for Cloud Chief. That's a little old settlement, which was the county seat at that time. And they'd go and they'd bring in flour and coffee, and of course tobacco, because everybody used tobacco, practically everybody. And the things that you could just get in the country store that you could haul in the wagon. It was about a 10-day trip from where we lived, southeast of Cloud Chief, to Minco. They did more freighting from Minco than they did El Reno. I don't remember my father ever making a trip to El Reno. I know some of them did in Custer County, of course that's near. And then that Sogden town, I kind of believe that was between Minco and Chickasee, but I'm vague on exactly the location. But that was one of the places that they'd freight from.
Was that 10 days for a round trip?
Yeah. Yeah, it'll take 10 to 15 days, depending on weather conditions, and the various things. But approximately, as I remember, it was about a 10-day trip. And when that happened, then the women folks and the kids would kind of huddle up together. I know Mother and I would huddle up with the MacDonalds. That was our people on the south. They had, the oldest boy was about 2 years younger than I. They eventually had 9 children. And there was another MacDonald family, no relation to them, lived in the same neighborhood, and they had 8 children. And, but at that time, there was only 2 of the MacDonald children. was the oldest boy that was.
Tell me, from the tent, what type of house did you move into?
We didn't move into a house. My father constructed a half dugout. Now most of the people that filed on the property there and stayed through with them had full dugouts covered entirely over with dirt. And the grass was growing right on the dirt. And they'd have a stove pipe that'd run from the stove up through the, generally one end through the roof of the house. They'd have logs and any lumber they could make out of cottonwood. And of course they put the dirt on top of that. And then the stove pipe would run up through that down to the stove, and it's generally just a cook stove. It didn't have heater, but of course you didn't need it anyway. Because you generally put it just a cook stove with all the heat you needed in there in a full dugout.
What's the difference between a dugout and a half dugout?
A half dugout is where you go down to about, I'd say approximately 5 feet, 4.5 to 5 feet. And of course, the wall would be perpendicular. Here's your dugout. Then you'd board up, get whatever board you could get. And of course, they freighted lumber from Menco and those places. You'd build up on the inside a wooden wall. You'd raise that up then probably 3 or 4 feet or 5 feet, would vary, above the ground, and you'd have a window glass there that would give you lights, you see, in the daytime. And the roof was wood. You didn't put dirt on top of the wood.
How far down in the ground was the half
Well,
dugout?
it would be approximately 4, maybe 5 feet, and then another 3 or 4 feet up above the ground, where you'd have a small window glass that you could see out and give you light.
What furnishings did you have in the half dugout?
We had a cook stove, and we had our bedsteads, if I remember then. I don't remember when we had them when we first moved in or not. I don't remember that because I don't remember when my father went to Menco or Sugden and picked up the household goods that we had taken in by a chartered car on the railroad. I don't remember when he brought them, but we had them up there when we were living in that half dugout. I know that, but when he got them, I don't recall.
How long did you live in the half dugout?
Until 1902, when an old neighbor we had, old man Jack Williams, who stuttered. And he was a carpenter in that he knew how to build a box house. My father didn't know anything about carpentry at all. And so he hired old man Williams, who lived about 2 miles from us, who lived in the house that he himself built. And he came over, and he and my father, the old man, planned it all, of course, and built a little 2-room house that was adjacent to the door that led into the half dugout. The north door of the 2-room house faced the south door of the half dugout, and of course there's a hallway built up leading from the house into the dugout, and of course rain and bad weather while you go in and out. And then we had a side door, one side door on the east side. I don't remember about the west side. I don't believe we had a door on the west side of that hallway, but you could lead out either from the dugout or the house out into the yard from this door on the east side.
Did you help your father break out sod?
No, I wasn't big enough to do that. See, in 1902, I was only 10 years old.
What chores did you do around the farm in those years?
Oh, in those years, I didn't do very much of anything except fiddle around in the garden, help my mother garden, collect garden stuff, and maybe hoe in the garden a little bit. And then I guess probably I did a little hoeing in the cotton patch when I was 10 years old and don't put on a light.
How many pounds of cotton could you pick in one day?
I don't know. I never was very good at it. I never was very good at any kind of farming work. I did it, and I didn't know anything else, of course. But I had a pony that I rode all the time when it got big enough to ride and go to church and Sunday school. I'd ride that pony, and I could saddle her. But to drive a team, I expect, probably 14 to 15 years old before I learned to drive a team in the field. I never drove a team to a wagon in my life. No matter I ever did. Because I didn't like horses, didn't like to mess with them. I didn't like anything but my little dog.
When did you start school?
I started the school, my first school was either 1899 or 1900. I forget which. I thought it was 1899, but I've since decided I was a year off on that because I had a schoolmate whose father was well educated. Now, very few people had more than a third grade education, but Mr. McDonald, the man that joined us on the South, was a school teacher. He had a fairly good education, and he also did preaching on the side. He was a radical, not a radical, but a loyal Methodist, and he preached some, teach school. And he was my first school teacher. Now, the other man that was well educated in the community was a fellow named Bryan, B.E. Bryan, that lived about 3 or 4 miles from us. And I didn't see very much of them, the Bryans, except the boys in school, and Joe and the other boy that died many years ago. They're all dead now, but anyhow, Joe's father kept a diary. They came to that country and homesteaded in 1893 from, I believe, from Texas, but I'm not right sure but what they were in one of the northern states, maybe, where the old man got his education. He was well educated for people at that time. In fact, he was later a member of the Constitutional Convention that organized the state of Oklahoma in the statehood. And he kept a diary of everything that happened. Well, according to his diary, Mr. McDonald, Bud McDonald, we call it, that's his nickname, taught his first school to Old Bethel, as a little old school there, in 1900. So I think that his diary would be more correct than my memory of 1899. But my first school, and the first school that he taught at Old Bethel, was in 1900, according to Mr. Bryan's diary, and I think that was my first school, so I think that was my first.
Was it all 8 grades in one room?
Oh, yes, we didn't have anything but one room school.
How does one teacher handle all 8 grades?
Well, there wasn't very many people, but they managed it all right. It might have been tough sometimes because one of my early elections happened when I was about 9 years old, when one of the boys, a 16-year-old boy that fell out with the teacher, Perry Evans. Perry Evans, a man 25 years old, I guess. And he kept, the teacher wanted to chastise the kid to keep him in after school. Give him a whipping or lecturing, whichever he decided to do. So this boy, the oldest, not the oldest boy, I guess he was the oldest boy of that particular family, Harv Minter. Harv was about 16 years old and I was about 9 years old. Now, he had a younger brother my age, but that's out of the question. But anyhow, he kept Harvey in one afternoon, gave him a whipping, something Harvey had done, whatever it was. But Harvey told me and the McDonald boys, me and Burnett McDonald, the oldest McDonald boy, he said, now he's not going to whip me, I'm going to whip him. Well, Burnett and I and one of the coffee boys, there was 3 of us, walked home together, see, lived the same distance. So we went about 100 yards out away from the schoolhouse and sat down on the side of the road in some bushes where we could see what's going on. Nobody was watching us anyway because everybody was going on. But pretty soon we heard the damnedest commotion up there at the schoolhouse. Heard glass shattering, boy, it sounded like it was tearing the house down. The next thing we saw Perry Evans, school teacher, running out of the house and jumping on his horse. Well, when he could clear away, well, then we went back up to the schoolhouse to see what happened to Harvey. Well, Harvey was still there and didn't have a mark on him, but Perry Evans had struck it. I mean, Perry Evans had struck it, Harvey met her, and stuck his hand and fist. Harvey dodged the blow, and he stuck his fist through the window glass and cut his arm, and he was nearly bleeding to death. Goes the blood all over the place there. And that was the way things happened. And of course, we'd slip off from school sometimes and go to the swimming hole, the old blue hole that was about 100 yards down in the creek there. It's on rough country, see, and these sinkholes develop into chug holes in the creek, and this one's big enough that we'd go swimming in there, and that's where I learned to swim. We'd slip off from school.
Did you have a dug well or a drilled well at the farm?
Well, we got a dug well in 1902, but prior to that time we had to haul water 3 miles with a wagon team, because where we lived, right in our neighborhood, was Jip Hills. It was a very rough farm, and that Jip water, you just could hardly drink it. It wasn't much good for even wash water. So the neighbors there, us, and the McDonald's, both McDonald farm families, and the Coffey family, which lived on farm southeast of us, we all hauled water from this farm on the, I can't think of that family name now. It was in the same school district, but 3 miles south of us, and there was no Jip Hills in there. They good water, sand in that landslide. All the neighbors hauled water from there with a wagon team.
You get it from a well or a spring?
It's a well.
Well.
Mm-hmm. Why can't I think of that? I think of
How'd you haul the water?
well, a wagon,
I mean, what in? A barrel of what?
50-gallon barrel.
50-gallon barrel. How long would
About the same thing as a 50-gallon liquor barrel, you see.
how long would 50 gallons last?
Oh, I don't know. You see, we pretty soon after we settled there, we had some help, and that a lot of people did dig cisterns, and then when we got to where we could get them brought in, you see, from the regular old. Those cisterns would be, they'd be approximately 5 or 6 feet tall and probably 3 or 4 feet in diameter. We set ours on top of the ground, but a lot of the people dug pits and put the cisterns underground, all except the top. And of course, they had a top big enough for a man to crawl in, and slanting, you see, side of the lid that fit on top of it. So the men, folks, could get in there, see, and kind of clean them out. And we used charcoal to seal the water through, so that lots of trash, come off the roof of the house. But that was after we, of course, got up in the house before we had. But then we'd haul water supplement that. And then in 1902, my father had a well drill, cut, dug. We didn't have any drills in those days. But we had 2 of the neighbors come in and dig that well. And they got water, but it was hard water. But at least that was a supplement.
Tell me about this pistol on the belt story.
This what?
Pistol on the belt?
Testing with a belt.
No, pistol in the belt.
Oh, that is later years. That was my preface that by saying that two of our neighbors that joined our farm on the east were outlaws, the Hughes boys. But, anyway, everybody carried guns in those days. The first revolver I ever owned, my father bought it for me when I was 13 years old and told me to carry it. He had a 32 Harrington and Richardson. No, not a Harrington Richardson. It was a 32 revolver, 5-shot revolver. I believe it might have been 6. I think it was 5. It was a safety gun. It had a arrangement on the trigger that when you pull the trigger, there would be a metal part that come up between the trigger and the firing pin. But when the trigger wasn't back, you could throw that gun around anyway, hammer the hammer if you wanted to. You call it the hammer. And it wouldn't fire. You had to pull the trigger to make it fire. Well, instead of buying me a gun like his, he bought me a 38 Harrington and Richardson. Well, that Harrington Richardson now was a caliber larger, and instead of having that safety feature on it, the end of the side of the hammer, you know, it strikes the firing pin with a tip just about that long. It was sharp, and when the hammer went down, that thing struck the firing pin and made it fire. Well, there was no safety on that thing. Whether the trigger was back or not, that hammer rested on that firing pin all the time. Well, the way we boys couldn't have leather holsters, we had to buy those, and of course we didn't have them wanted to buy them anymore. To buy tobacco, we had to steal our daddy's tobacco. But anyhow, we'd snap that on our drawers ring. We all wore long handled drawers back in those days, we call them. We'd snap that trigger on a heavy band of your drawers, and it would protect it from firing unless it got a blow of some kind. And that's the way we carried our damn guns, at least the way some of us did. Some of the boys made holsters out of cloth and different. But I went to a revival meeting one night, and that was in 1909. Now that's a little more recent. And of course I carried that gun. Got on the horse to go home. There was a big crowd there, of course. Well, I hadn't more than got on her. I don't know if she jumped a little bit or what happened, but anyway, that gun fired. And the bullet hit her. It set her in the backbone and you could measure it, I believe. You know how a saddle built with that opening between the back of the horn where you can see the saddle blanket. It just hit her as center in the backbone. It looked like it could be, but I knew I wasn't hit, and I knew she had to be hit. So I waited for her home as fast as I could make her go. 4.5 miles, and I figured every minute she's going to drop dead. I got home and skinned off my blanket, that saddle and blanket, a little blood on the blanket, but not much, and I kind of kept that concealed from Dad. Folks were there too, but they were, of course, in a buggy with another team. And I got that mare loose and turned her out in the pasture as quick as I could. Got in and got to bed. Because I didn't want Dad to know if that had happened. Because he'd have spanked my little ass for letting it happen when, as a matter of fact, it was his fault. He was buying me a gun like that. But he never did know it. But about 3 weeks later, that mare just kept drooping around. I thought all the time she was going to die. But she got better and seemed to be all right. So kind of forgot about it. But I happened to look one day and saw a little knot on the side of her shoulder. You know how an animal's shoulder is down here, kind of wide area with a heavy flesh. I saw that knot and I began to look at it and feel on it, and I pulled a little bit of hair and skin back, and there was that damn bullet. Of course, I just lifted the bullet out because it's well and been well. Don't die, I'd almost forgotten it. And that was that incident. And nobody ever knew that but my buddy Esther Montgomery. And of course, he and I told each other everything. But nobody ever knew that but the two of us. And I told other people later. I never did tell my father. Never, not during his lifetime did he ever know about it.
When did you get drafted?
When did I get drafted?
Yes, sir.
It was April the 27th, 1918.
Tell me about basic training.
Damn little. We, the troop train, of course, took several from Washita County, but that wasn't confined to Washita, just from whatever county they happened to be ready to go, have them ready to go, you know. It hadn't been exempted or just qualified to go. They took it on a trip train, and of course, from there, we took that train, and it was a long train, of course, and hundreds of soldiers, I don't know how many. But draftees were not soldiers yet. We went straight straight to San Antonio, Texas, to Camp Travis. We unloaded there, and we were in I forget what they call it, where they put you in barracks there, just waiting for you to be checked in, signed as whatever outfit they expect you to be in. And there was two boys from my county, Bert Allen and Roy Zellner. They were both assigned to the infantry, 357th Infantry. I was assigned to 3/4 Force Machine Gun.
What division were you in?
90th.
90th?
So at the interview now, when they assigned me to the first on the training though, I had 3 months training, and practiced all that 3 months. One time I was out one time in rapid fire with a 500 round rapid fire with a rifle, and that's a hard job. Now, 500 rounds with a kid that never shot a gun like that is work. But anyway, I took months, and I was under quarantine when all the rest of the boys were out getting training with machine guns. And of course, they had some riflemen in machine guns. But anyway, I was a month board. I wasn't sick, but I was just sitting there on my can, taking it easy and getting plenty to eat when all the other boys out training. It came time to go, and I was over the months, of course, and it didn't bother me anyway. But anyway, we in trained then, and but when I was being assigned, the way they did that, there was a major, Ernest O. Thompson, who was at that time a captain. He was a captain of headquarters 3/4 Machine Gun. There was 5 companies in a battalion, 4 combat companies in the headquarters company, and they assigned me to headquarters. And the way that happened, the major would get the names of all of us, you see, that to be assigned, and I was assigned to that machine gun outfit. The old major, captain then was Thompson, told McKinney, the personnel sergeant who was reading the things off and doing the book work for the captain. And he read all what the qualifications were, and shown at the time we was drafted, you see. Well, he read my name, J.T. Bailey, lawyer. And the old captain said, McKinney says, for Christ's sake, he said, get that fellow, says maybe he can read and write. And McKinney told me about it later. And of course that was a joke. I was in that outfit throughout. He couldn't put me in the privates, the boy that really did the fighting, because he had more all the privates that the regulations permit. So he said, well, he said, I want to keep that fellow because he said we're going to have book work a long time. He said, keep him in there. But no way. McKinney checked up and found out that there was a room for another wagoner. Now, a wagoner is a fellow that drives the drives a mule to a machine gun cart. But a machine gun, in those days, with 8 men and a mule. Well, this mule pulled a machine gun, you see, place to place. And of course, the 8 men operated in combat. Well, he ranked me as a wagoner. Well, I never drove a mule in my life. Haven't to this day. I never did. My dad had horses, but I never did drive a horse even. But I ranked as a wagoner throughout. I didn't get any promotion. I avoided it, strictly avoided. I could have gone to horses training school. Of course, I was a lawyer then.
Yeah. What kind of machine gun did you have?
Vickers.
Vickers?
Vickers, yes. Later, actually armistice now, after the war was over, we were still in the Army, of course. They assigned the Browning, which was a faster gun, and probably the more dependable, but it was lighter and faster than the Vickers.
Tell me about jumping quarantine at Coney Island.
Oh, that was, when we were in train, we took the train to New York. Coney Island was, I forget the name of that camp. We were there about 10 days, but anyway, we're on the train, and not only all day, but about night we got into New York, but instead of going to camp, they routed that train way up through Canada, and we were on that troop train all night in Canada. And those Canadian people were at the train every time we came through the train. We stopped there, right there, greeting us. If they didn't stop there, thousands of people at every station waving their hands. Of course, Canada got shot all to pieces during the First and Second Battle of the Monarch, I guess is one of what. That's all I heard. Now I don't know this except hearsay. But they'd been ruined. They were defeated practically in those two battles. The way they fought, anyway. Those people you saw, they were extremely patriotic, and all night long they were there waiting. Then about daybreak or in the early morning hours, we came back into New York State and went to Coney Island. Well, while we were there now, it was discovered when we got ready to sail overseas, the report came out that there was a fellow in the camp there had spinal meningitis. Of course, that's, I guess, highly contagious. So we had to stay there 10 days, and that was all cleared up. And then they put us on a little old freight boat, the Italia. It was an English freight boat. And the way the freight boats were constructed, and it wasn't a passenger boat. We came home on a passenger boat later, but anyway, this little Italia, they called it. I guess some Italians that were Englishmen, I don't know how they got that name, but anyway, the sides of that boat would say, here's an upright, and here's an upright, and here's a big metal door that you lay it down and flatten it out to load freight on. It's practically water level, you see, at that point. Well, about the third day out, and we were, as I remember, 18 days getting over on that little old thing. We ran into a storm the first or second night after we sailed from New York. And the storm jerked that one of those doors down, and the water flushed in. And I thought sure we were going to sink, but they had constructed, I guess, so there wouldn't be much water down below. And of course, down below is where we supposed to be. But another soldier and I were out there watching the storm, and of course we didn't give a damn about getting wet. We weren't worried about that. But anyway, we got up on the hatchway now up here. The two ends stood up, you see, and then this door went down. Well, when the door went down, this fellow up there with me, it threw him down the hatchway and broke his arm. Well, I held on to the rail with one hand and didn't take me down, or I got wet. Then, all the rest of the way over, of course, a lot of the boys were seasick, definitely sick.
You need to back up now and tell the story about the trip to Coney Island, though, when you jumped the quarantine.
Oh, yeah. During that 10 days while we were waiting on the quarantine to be lifted, Coney Island is a resort there where they had all these rides that you see, I guess, still on tracks, you see, trailer rides. And one of my buddies and I broke the quarantine line and slipped off and went to that Coney Island there. And of course, lots of New York girls there that they were interesting characters. And we spent the entire night there, and when it came daylight, we think, my God, we better get back, because it's about time for Reveille, and when the Reveille comes on, we're supposed to be in the line, see, answering our call. So we rushed to the line and got there, just getting daylight then, and we were doing it in ranks at that time. Well, this guard now was walking guard, you see it, nobody came in or out there. And he got his back turned, and then we slipped across that line right quick, and we beat it to Reveille. We got there just in time to get in the rank to Reveille to answer. And then from then on, of course, we're going overseas.
What's a whiz bang?
Hmm?
What's a whiz bang?
Whiz bang is what is a cartridge with a bullet in it, about 1 inch in diameter. And it's a little old cannon that you roll around on 2 wheels. You don't have to have a mule, but a lot of men manipulate that. I never manipulated one in my life, but I never saw one in operation really, except at the distance. But it's a thing that they use to get men with that were trying to get away. If there were some Germans out here, you see, and they were maybe operating machine gun, maybe not at us, but if they bore us further away, or maybe they're operating cannons, small cannons. But it is really a little cannon, 1 inch diameter, and there's no way to dodge them. Now, of course, you can dodge a thing from a 6-inch shell up. You can dodge them. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But that whiz bang, bang whiz, bang whiz, bang whiz. And when it says bang whiz, it's too late to dodge it. You can't dodge it. It's too fast for you.
Yeah. Tell me about being in combat in France. Tell me about being in combat. What was it like?
Well, that's a long, long story. I was under enemy fire for 76 consecutive days. The first combat we experienced was at a little town. It was Mouzin, M-O-U-I-S-C-O-U-R. It's French name. Mouzincourt or Aubincourt. I believe it was Mouzincourt. We might have had a little bit of enemy fire, artillery, of course, at Aubincourt, but the main one was Mouzincourt, which was about 18 or 20 miles from the firing line. Mind you, I was a machine gun now, and at that time, the enemy was retreating. The enemy was whipped, really, when we got in, because our division was late. One of the divisions that got shot all to pieces was the regular army divisions, mainly the 42nd Division, which was a regular army division, and the 5th Division, which I believe was a regular army division. They both got shot all to pieces.
Tell me about the first time you saw the Germans. What'd you do?
The first time I saw them?
Yeah.
Oh, the first time I saw them was when our outfit captured some German soldiers. And that was up at Saint-Miel, when the Germans that were in the retreat, but they didn't get away, and so they were captured. And there was either 4, 6, or there might have been 8 of them. I didn't pay much attention to them, but the only thing interesting about that was that when they was captured, they were disarmed, of course, and then an armed soldier, or maybe a couple of soldiers, would march them back to headquarters where they were put in jail, so to speak. Well, that's the first time that I was up close to a German, except dead ones at Saint-Miel, I'm talking about now. And we had an Indian boy in my company. It was I don't know what tribe he was. His name was Imitashi. Well, he was one of these slow-moving, heavy-set, burly fellows. It didn't talk much. Now, some Indians won't talk at all. Didn't help it. Others talk their heads off to you. But this Indian wouldn't talk much. He wouldn't say anything to you unless you addressed him. Then he wouldn't talk if you could help it. But he took those Indians back to, started back to headquarters with them. Well, he wouldn't go on but a little while and came back. So I don't remember whether the captain asked him or whether one of the sergeants asked him and said, Amidashi, made a mighty quick trip. What did you do? Did the prisoner get away from you? No. Well, what happened then? Tell me what happened. Him run. Me shoot. That's all he'd say. Me shoot. Well, of course, he just got the back kicked out away from headquarters. He just deliberately shot him down. That's what happened. Of course, there was never any investigation. Nobody gave a damn.
What did you do in the Battle of St. Mihiel? What did you do in that battle, St. Mihiel?
I was still in headquarters company, and headquarters then had to do just what it did Camp Travis. We had to be there when the caisson wagons came in with supplies for the boys that were firing the guns. We had to distribute that stuff to the boys that were shooting. I never fired a machine gun but once in my life, and that was back in just to say I shot one. I didn't shoot one in battle at all. But I was right there in more danger than the fellows that were doing the firing because I had to get food to them to help you, of course.
Yeah.
Committee of
Tell me some more about the general combat situation.
Well, it is a thing that is kind of hard to describe, and nobody could believe a lot of things that happened, of course. But at first, the first battle was the Battle of St. Mihiel. That's the first battle that, other than just skirmishes that didn't amount to anything. After the 12th of September 1918, the way that was conducted now, the Germans were holed in. They had deep dugouts. They had every luxury in the world that they wanted. All the liquor they wanted to drink and everything they wanted to drink. But they had been there about 4 or 5 years, just, well, since about the beginning of the war. They'd never been disturbed very much.